When I published my video covering the launch of the Sky Glass Gen 2 a few months ago, I was somewhat surprised by the number of critical comments leveled at the TV before it even hit the market, with one in particular claiming that you would be better off buying a 250 quid soundbar and another TV. God bless YouTube's comment section. With that in mind, I purchased a 55-inch Samsung Q80D for £700, which is £250 less than the £950 list price of a 55-inch Sky Glass Gen 2. In this White Room sequence from The Matrix, the Sky Glass Gen 2 was able to render the background in a brighter manner than the Samsung Q80D, therefore coming closer to matching the HDR presentation on a Sony HX3110 mastering monitor. Beyond a white background, the Sky Glass Gen 2 also reproduced the flaming guitar scene in Mad Max Fury Road in a more impactful manner than the Samsung Q80D, which is not surprising once you learn about the brightness capabilities of the Sky Glass Gen 2 despite not featuring mini LED technology. Full screen luminance measured above 900 nits, easily one of the brightest if not the brightest in its price class. Otherwise, HDR peak brightness measured close to 1200 nits on a 10% window after calibration to D65 white point, going up to even 1500 nits on a 50% window. The underlying display technology that made this level of brightness possible on the Sky Glass Gen 2 was a VA-type LCD panel with a native contrast ratio of 5700:1 when measured on a 4x4 ANSI checkerboard pattern with local dimming disabled. It is a QLED panel with quantum dot technology, yielding a DCI-P3 color gamut coverage of 97% in UV terms and REC 2020 coverage of 78%. Using our own custom-authored test pattern containing a small white box scrolling horizontally and then vertically against a black background, we counted 104 independently dimmable zones in an 8x13 grid on our 55-inch review sample. While the local dimming algorithm on the Sky Glass Gen 2 was noticeably more effective than that observed on the original Sky Glass, it still didn't deliver as high a contrast as that seen on the Samsung Q80D, mainly because the Sky Glass Gen 2 doesn't completely switch off its backlight even on full field black, resulting in a higher black floor most of the time, not to mention grayer top and bottom letterbox bars in CinemaScope movies. At the other end of the contrast ratio spectrum, the Sky Glass Gen 2 was also unable to illuminate small bright highlights in real-world HDR content to the same level as the Samsung Q80D, which we attribute to the former's less aggressive local dimming, which also contributed to a slower dimming response and more visible blooming artifacts around bright objects on screen. Now, one way to increase the perceived image depth on the Sky Glass Gen 2 is by engaging auto backlight adjustment, which we would normally disable on every other television. You see, due to the M-Logic chipset used, SDR gamma was fixed at 2.2 on the Sky Glass Gen 2, with no gamma control available in the picture menu to rectify the issue for watching in a dark room. However, it appears that Sky engineers have designed the auto backlight adjustment setting to automatically adjust the SDR output to 100 nits, 2.4 gamma in a dimly lit environment, allowing the Sky Glass Gen 2 to more faithfully reproduce the creative intent for both SDR and HDR content. So we would recommend keeping auto backlight adjustment on at all times, just like a priest with his collar. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed the grayscale being slightly red-tinted relative to D65 white point, but in practice, colors on the Sky Glass Gen 2 did not look too far off a Sony BVM-HX3110, suggesting that Sky may have adopted an alternate white point that's perceptually matched to D65 on a dual-layer LED LCD panel. For both HDR and Dolby Vision picture modes, the default out-of-the-box setting was bright, but you should change it to dark for a more accurate presentation during dark room viewing. If you are not already aware, Sky broadcasts its HDR catalog in HLG for display, and based on side-by-side comparison against a 4K Blu-ray player played in HDR10, the HLG presentation on the Sky Glass Gen 2 appeared slightly brighter than reference, with some blowout of highlight detail, even with HDR picture mode set to dark. The Sky Glass Gen 2 manifested obvious posterization when fed a 4K UHD video signal at 12-bit 444 chroma, which is typically the default output from most 4K Blu-ray players. Fortunately, reducing the chroma resolution from external sources to 422 worked well to restore smooth native 10-bit gradation. Sky is aware of this issue and has confirmed it will be addressed in a future software update as part of the company's commitment to improve the TV over time. Assessment of upscaling and deinterlacing were not really relevant on this TV, since most owners would be watching programs in 2160p from the Sky OS platform. Screen uniformity was decent for an LED LCD television, with our 55-inch review unit exhibiting minor dirty screen effect or DSE, as well as some vignetting along the sides owing to the narrower viewing angles of the VA-type LCD panel. Talking of which, the panel is only 60Hz instead of 120Hz, so naturally none of the 3 HDMI ports on the Sky Glass Gen 2 support HDMI 2.1 signaling for 4K 120Hz gameplay. Lord, have mercy on PS5 and Xbox Series X owners. You cannot manually engage game mode on the TV since it's not available as an option in the picture settings. But by sending an ALLM info frame to the TV, we measured an input lag of around 16 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, as long as you haven't gone into the user menu and turned off auto game mode, which was enabled by default from factory. In terms of HDRG calibration, the Sky Glass Gen 2 had clipped at 1200 nits for both Max TML and Max FFTML, in line with the TV's measured HDR peak brightness on a 10% window, so HDRG compliant games could be rendered with maximum HDR impact without suffering from highlight clipping or double tone mapping. On the latest software build at the time we filmed this video in May 2025, the Sky Glass Gen 2 was no longer plagued by bothersome frame skipping during gameplay in auto game mode. Another downside of the 60Hz panel on the TV was that no motion interpolation was available to reduce motion blur. But one slight consolation was that you won't see any interpolation artifacts whatsoever, unlike the 120Hz Samsung Q80D, which would apply interpolation for one frame during scene cuts even with all motion settings disabled in the picture menu, leading to intermittent frame drops in certain sequences involving a drastic change in contrast from one scene to the next. Otherwise, the Sky Glass Gen 2 handled 24, 25, 50 and 60 FPS content from external sources without any problems, in particular refreshing at 48Hz for 24 FPS films to bypass the restriction of the 60Hz panel, which would normally induce telecenic judder on lesser TVs. Note that films on Sky's catalog are presented at 25 frames per second, meaning titles originally mastered at 24 FPS would run that bit faster. Sound quality is undoubtedly the standout feature of the Sky Glass Gen 2. The dual subwoofers injected even more bass and authority to the audio output, while the 3 fun-firing speakers and 2 up-firing drivers delivered an immersive Dolby Atmos bubble that's unheard of at this price point. Admittedly, these sound components contribute to a thicker chassis, and on occasion, the strong low end can bleed slightly into the mids, causing dialogue to reverberate ever so subtly. Make no mistake though, with enough volume, we believe the Sky Glass Gen 2 could easily outperform most if not all 250 quid soundbars, especially those that lack a dedicated subwoofer. Which brings us neatly to our overall verdict. The Sky Glass Gen 2 is a solid choice for those seeking a convenient all-in-one solution without the need for an external soundbar, set-top box, satellite dish or aerial, provided you are comfortable with Sky's subscription-based ecosystem. Depending on how much value you place on the integrated sound system, which delivers the most impressive audio we've heard from a sub-£1,000 TV, the QLED LCD panel on the Sky Glass Gen 2 is not without its strengths, but also won't provide the last word in picture quality, though it's clearly improved over its predecessor, particularly in local dimming performance. Brightness full screen is the highest in its price class, and Sky has made a commendable effort to respect the creative intent, especially when benchmarked against a reference monitor, something not often prioritized in this segment. But ultimately, The 60Hz panel, which precludes HDMI 2.1 gaming and motion interpolation, won't convert gamers and video enthusiasts who may also have to look elsewhere if they crave for more local dimming zones or even OLED's pixel-level light control. Of course, many of the design choices of the Sky Glass Gen 2 reflect a conscious effort to keep costs in check while offering class-leading sound and integrated streaming convenience. But if you are operating on an even tighter budget, Sky has rolled out a more affordable Sky Glass Air model, and you can find out more about this TV from our coverage video you can watch by clicking here.